Welcome to my very first Kindness Habit podcast. And I'm so excited to have the guest who actually was a neighbor of the king of kindness, Mr. Rogers. So we have known each other for over 4 years. And I first reached out because of your documentary. I was so struck by the power of Mr. Rogers. As a child, I was only allowed to watch PBS. And so Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, like those were my main shows. Yeah. So we go back 4 years, and Benjamin and I, he was so gracious. I reached out on LinkedIn, and since then we've created a relationship. So thank you so much for joining the Kindness Habit today, Benjamin. And so today we're just going to get some ideas on, first, I want you to introduce yourself, tell us where you are, but also let us know just a little bit about your family. And then we're going to dig right into Mr. Rogers and also some ideas about what people can do to be kinder to themselves.
Great. After 25 plus years in New York City, like right in New York City on the island of Manhattan, left in 2019, moved to my wife's hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, figuring it's reasonably located on the Interstate 95 corridor, Philadelphia, New York City, kept commuting back and forth until, of course, March of 2019. Did I get the years right? It's like this lost blip in time in which I obviously went nowhere and started working into a computer screen. So I'm VCing in from beautiful Wilmington, Delaware, along the banks of the Brandywine River. I'm a father of 2 daughters. I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, and a wife of 15 years named Abigail. And it is lovely to acclimate to a bucolic little corner of this country. I'll start there. It is a notable difference experientially from waking up and going downstairs and nodding at the doorman and running to the subway and just go, you know? So it's delightful.
Oh yeah. Well, I was saying, I remember the last time we talked, you were outside and you were really more just in the moment with nature. You were enjoying the birds. And so really just to slow down. So let's start there, because you were just telling me the huge changes that you've made from going to the city to really just slowing down. So we, during the pandemic, we've all had to slow down. We've all, had to look at life just a little bit differently. But what has been the biggest change for you once you got to actually slow down a little bit?
Well, and to be clear, we made a conscious decision. It felt untenable on so many levels pre-pandemic, my wife and I, for our family. And I'd been working in New York City, kind of just grinding, just high. I mean, when I was in, when you're surrounded by high pressure, you don't think of it as high pressure. And maybe I'm certain that folks have much more high pressure existences than I did. But it got to a point where, I was gone 50% of the time from my family, half of that time in New York, half of that time traveling the whole planet, and for a large period of time working around breaking news, which is highly stressful and tends to also leave you not at home. So the pace of things was bananas. And we knew this intellectually, my wife and I. And we even began to see some evidence in the way our girls were developing. My eldest, Maggie, still often covers her ears because it was so darn noisy in that city. So when it gets particularly noisy, she still does that. But we really intentionally chose to step off and out before we all were sort of forced to step off. Many of us, not all, to be fair, were asked to step off and step out, and really we had to close, sort of the doors around ourselves and hanker down. And so forth. So the gap, the experiential gap between how I lived 5 years ago, even 4 when we met, and today is probably measurable in symptoms. It's certainly measurable in like my blood pressure. I think it's measurable in the quantity of headaches that I have, or the way that my body feels every day, or the speed with which my frontal lobe is processing all the things. And I guess I would just conclude it with this, which is to say that leads me to a place of gratitude, to say like, well, thank goodness that we had that optionality and we constructed it and we worked hard to try and figure out how to do it. But a lot of things had to conspire to make that possible. So I have a song where I talk about waking up from a long dream in a backyard full of stars. And that's how it's felt. And I don't think I'm alone. One of the things Fred used to say is, quoting a friend of his, a philosopher named Henry Nouwen, that which is most personal is most universal. And, we know with even the sort of mythology around the Great Resignation, I think we know that the statistics support that people are under more stress than ever before, like something like 70% or 75%. And this is the data I had is from like a year or two ago, right? Early pandemic stuff, like everybody's under pressure and under stress. And you begin to feel that manifest, I would feel it manifest in New York, or even when that initial lockdown happened with it, a tightness in your chest, a shortness in your breath, right? The inability to see the future optimistically. And I think where we're headed is like, how do you begin to claw your way out of that? How do you take agency over that experience? That's kind of been the trick lately. And that's where the backyard comes in, or taking the walk in the park, or taking a deep breath, going for a hike. I mean, the least we can do is take a deep breath. It's a great place to start.
Oh yeah. Well, no, and there is so much research behind what nature does for us. Even if it is just a 10-minute walk outside to get fresh air, that makes such a huge. Yes. And just,
I think there's the sort of ambient experience. I have this dear friend, the ambient experience reminds me of this dear friend, Matt Tusignut. He's a somatic psychologist up in Bucks County. I've known him since we were 15. And we spent a lot of our time as kids, and we do still as adults, meeting in Valley Forge Park, which is a national park that was right down the hill from where I grew up, going for a walk in the woods. And the thing we're coming back to, and now he's kind of a global figure in this Brima movement, is this idea that we forget that we are of nature. We are a part of the natural world. Right. Just as our houses are built of cement, like we are creatures. And so the idea that we would have these very dramatic, visceral responses to big traumas like a pandemic is super reasonable. Because I had the good fortune to go on safari with my wife and kids in South Africa. Right before we left New York, we decided we're just going to go bananas and take a crazy trip. One day, we're out with the guide, and it's a kind of tumultuous day weather-wise, and we're watching, no joke, a bunch of giraffe, like 17 giraffe, and a big gust of wind blows, and the sort of alpha goes like this, and the gusts get bigger, and they all run for it, right? We're all those giraffes.
Right.
And I find that going there helps me forgive myself for very fundamental responses like stress, right? Getting hot. I feel hot when I'm stressed, right? Do you, right? Like you start to feel like your brain's moving too fast. Your pulse moves back. You start to lose control, because if you're that giraffe, you think you're in danger, and everything is saying survive, right? And survival is run for it, fight for it, freeze, or appease is the new one, right? Hey, hey, wind, let me talk you out of being a risk, right? So I just, and this is all stuff I've really dug into in the last, I don't know, probably in the arc of time from when I was leaving MTV News in 2013, 14. And the movie was coming out, which was about 2010 or 12. I was becoming a dad. Work was going from stressful to bananas to off the charts. And I just had to find new resources, or I was afraid I was going to snap or something. I just felt like I was running out of tools. I ran out of tools. How about that? You know what I mean? So it was almost an imperative. And so you reaching out on LinkedIn is the kind of thing when those signals come to me, I'll listen.
Right. So let's tell the listeners just about why you wrote the movie. And then also, you've had a lot of things happen that you also share with Mr.Rogers, about how he's so into being present and he loved nature. So, I know the listeners want to hear first how you got to know him, but also just what are some lessons that are in your movie, but also that you learned from him that you really are seeing more clearly today than you ever have?
Yeah. My own personal experience in the last few years, but I think all of our experience. And I do a podcast for about a year and a half now. So I've been, in essence, my thesis was, it's called Friends and Neighbors. And my thinking was, if we're all a kind of community of people. And we all are under stress. Like, what if I reach out to somebody for help? Because helping people feels good for them. And it helps me. And if we broadcast it, as we're doing, or narrowcast it, or put it in a newsletter, it's going to help more than me and you, right? And so that's kind of was the impulse. And in a lot of ways, so much of my thinking since I met Mr. Rogers, which is on my 30th birthday, I'll tell you, the sort of voiceover goes, Mr. Rogers summered in a modest gray shake shingle house on the edge of Nantucket Island. My mother rented a tiny cottage next door. So Mr. Rogers really was my neighbor. So, Nantucket, which, to be fair, is a very tony piece of real estate in the Atlantic Ocean off of Boston, a place where people, for the most part, with the means, go. And I just think it's important to own that. And Fred was raised with means, which gave him, I think, the cushion to sustain the risk of pursuing something that was absolutely unprecedented, which was public broadcasting. He basically invented it, right, back in the late 1960s. So anyway, my mother knew I was under stress at work. At this point, I must have been a sort of middle manager at MTV News, which had sort of been a dream job ever since I was a little kid. The sort of source of that dream was music. Always soothed me, singing to it, listening to it. From the time I was a baby, my mom was learning classical guitar when I was in her womb. So I think your average scientist would call that epigenetics, right? Like, my very DNA has a G chord in it. So, and sometimes I often when I reflect on why I don't have like a great pantheon of like Eddie Van Halen chords or lines in my guitar playing, all you need is G, C, and D, because that's what soothed me. So I was under a lot of duress working at MTV News, just your average run-of-the-mill breaking news kind of thing. And my mom was like, you should come out to Nantucket to kind of catch your breath, and you'll never believe who I just met. So she was studying theology at the time and out front of her cottage reading a book, and Fred swam every morning in the bay behind his house. And he struck up a conversation. And so I went out there on my 30th birthday weekend and was on the back porch on my BlackBerry, if you remember those.
Oh, yeah.
And Fred walked up and said, is the birthday boy here? And, you're like, oh.
You're like, Fred Rogers.
And that's where it starts. So it was 2001. And over the course, he invited us over the next day. I had my guitar. I was about to put out a record called Crash Site, which basically was my sort of best editorial effort at making sense of my parents being divorced when I was a kid, us moving across the country when I was a kid, not really having, my dad did his best, but he was 1,000 miles away. I had my jaw broken when I was 17 by a kid on the football team who didn't like who I was dating. Like, enough things in succession that I actually was moving through the world unwittingly full of anxiety and fear, right? And so
your outlet was music.
Well, my coping and my outlet was music, like this really authentic, vulnerable expression of kind of how I was experiencing the world, which was one of Fred's. So meeting him was, obviously in retrospect, 20 years, it feels like, well, of course, how could that not have happened? But the idea of who he was in the world, a real healer, a guy who saw the space between the camera and himself as a sacred one, an ordained Presbyterian minister who was using television to basically evangelize, to use your word, kindness, which for me, I gave this some thought prior to this discussion, boils down to, like, I think, how present can we be for each other?
I love that.
And that means how little stuff, protection can I put between us? How much vulnerability can I share with you? How much of my real stuff, like the stuff where it's like, I loved R.E.M. growing up, right? So this song keeps coming to me. Everybody hurts, right? What if we start there? And I think, the next day when I went over to sing for Fred, I sang a song called Summer's Gone. It was a song I wrote about college and that feeling of, oh God, what now, right? It's so funny to talk about at this age, but these are real feelings of what's happening, the what's next. And he took me on a tour of his house, and in his office, he played Happy Birthday. He played Won't You Be My Neighbor? And then he says to me, tell me about your parents' divorce. I haven't heard much about your dad. And you're just like, because I had all those years of trust in him because I grew up watching him like you.
Right.
But also because I was with someone who practiced every day being present with himself and being present with those around him. A lot of people who work with him would say, you know, when Fred got locked in on somebody, you just couldn't move. Like, it was difficult to do anything in the real world. He would engage so deeply with the kid he bumped into on the store, or with on the corner, with the guy on the subway, with the person at the deli, you know, just people being which I think we've seen a lot less of in the last few years, because I want to go back to the giraffes, we're so scared, and that's reasonable. But it helps to know it.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yes.
It helps to start with, okay, so if everybody hurts and we're all scared, and that's fine, you're safe with that with me. Then what can we do? And that's like, what a gift. And by the way, I would never have articulated that way to your question 10, 20 years ago. I was a young producer at a channel that I thought was making largely junk food. And I worked in a part of it for a guy who did great things. My boss, Dave Srolnik, just was an executive producer on the Questlove doc. The guy's gold, right? But we were a tiny little fiefdom of like, rebels. You know, it was like the Death Star, and we were like, we can fix it. You know, and then I jumped to Facebook, which was amazing for a zillion reasons, and probably 4x as challenging.
Than MTV.
Yeah, than the prior 18 years at MTV. Intellectually, in terms of pace, somatically, stakes. You know, the worst MTV would do is put something like Jersey Shore on and kind of make the world a little bit dumber. And I some of the I've worked with Snooki. She's a lovely young woman, but nobody's going to point at this stuff as like elevating the discourse, right? I worked with a lot of people who were working very hard to make the world a better place at both places. But you know, Facebook was a very difficult place to work. There's a lot of high stakes. You know, I mean, the ramifications of an algorithm going sideways, or a misunderstanding between how the company does work and how the world thinks it's working. When you have 4 billion customers, that's real. And so, you know, I kind of went, well, what's the expression, out of the kettle into the, you know, from hot to hotter, you know?
Oh yeah, right.
Into the fire. But you know, there for the grace of God go I, and here I am. And my hope, and the work I try and do every day, whether it's on the street with somebody I meet, or with my kids, or with somebody who I get to talk to like yourself, or somebody I'm consulting or coaching, is how do we show up for each other? How do we communicate with each other? Like, I can build websites and apps, and I can help people on strategy and business, but what I really am interested in is how do we show up for each other in a way that is additive, healing for each other, that makes our companies and our communities healthier, and the planet a place that we can all live for a long time together. Not someone in this neighborhood with the good stuff and someone in this neighborhood with no stuff. Like, that's not working. We've tried it.
Oh,
so,
yes, for sure.
And the longer I just to put a T on it, in New York City, you know, Mayor Bloomberg was the mayor. You know, you had these sort of like very well-funded, very like sort of celebrity politicians. The civics felt nearly, you know, Hillary Clinton, you know, civics was nearly untouchable for me. There were 9 million people on the island. I didn't feel connected. And I happened to have moved into a neighborhood that is loaded with civic engagement. And it is a revelation. So the longer I do this work and the more I talk about it, the sort of more I feel like I'm coming closer to some of the work that I hope I'm on earth to do. Senator Chris Coons lives across the street, who's a pretty right and just US Senator. Senator Sarah McBride lives in the apartment building a couple blocks away. She's the United States first state senator, first transgender state senator, first ever, right? Just this figure, this towering figure. And I'm surrounded by all kinds of people who are engaged in a way that is so inspiring. I'm reminded of this idea of entropy, right? Systems, if you don't put energy in them, they run out of energy. And the thing I find, and I think this will go to what you're asking about nature, Allison, is that you got to put energy into the system.
Yes.
If it's a relationship,
you got
to show up. If it's a community, we got to vote, and we got to probably go sweep the streets on Earth Day or whatever. Like we got to get our hands. Sheryl Sandberg used to say, the future belongs to the people who get their hands muddy, right? You got to get your hands in the dirt. My mom likes to call it elbow grease, right?
Well, and I think that's a good point, because I think so many people forget their power, that small little changes, or picking up a piece of trash in your neighborhood can make a big difference.
Totally.
And Mr. Rogers, in your documentary, you talk about like how passionate he was to really be deep and simple, to like go deeper, to slow down. And I know that you've made some changes since you've left Facebook I relate to this a lot when I'm coaching my clients, like Kroger and Niagara Water and Hanger Clinics and like big corporations, that so many people are not being as mindful as they could, and we're not listening to what's going on in our body. So what advice would you give people, and just what has been your experience since you did leave Facebook? You had time to slow down a bit, and then you really started just to work on yourself. So this would be really useful for people listening to this, because so many people that I coach have said that they have this problem. I have a scorecard with the kindness habit, and self is the first thing. And it's normally the lowest, that people aren't giving themselves, this energy and attention. And Mr. Rogers was so faithful. I remember his weight was always 143. I love you. Yeah. He would swim every morning. Like he was so dedicated. To his health. So what have you experienced? Like, what was your aha moment? But also, what advice would you give listeners to be kinder and to listen to ourselves better?
Well, I'll give you my experience and my aha. And I hope it'll lead to the sort of a guidance or the advice. But when I was a younger person, particularly when I was like, let's say, leaving college and kind of finding my own way in the world, I gravitated often to like cross-country trips and solo adventures that put me square in nature. I drove cross-country when I was 19, back when, there was no MapQuest or whatever it is, no Waze.
Right. You had to use an actual map.
It was a paper map, And I spent a summer out in Telluride, Colorado, and I always, it's a place where I feel still. And so at a certain point in my career, as it became clear to me that MTV was becoming, I'd been there 18 years. I was senior vice president. I was running MTV News. I was working across MTV, VH1, and CMT. I was going to all three channels events, Oscars, Grammys, CMT, South by Southwest. I was always moving. We were always creating, right? And that was ramping up, and also the stakes were changing, and it felt like the internal organization was shifting, and I kind of got this spidey sense that it was time to make a transition. And I did a number of things, which I often share with people, and I'll bullet point for you, which is I found myself a great coach to help keep me accountable and help me work through some of the self-talk and some of the strategy of how to exit. I enrolled in a fellowship at Columbia, which was obviously life-changing in terms of the people I met, but also gave me great foundation on sort of organizational transformation. And I hired, this is super simple, but I hired a resume person to work with me on sharpening the marketing language about how I present in the world. And I'm a guy who's written his whole life, who writes songs, who made a movie, but I was like, you know what? So as Fred Rogers said, always look for the helpers. But as all that stuff was happening, this transition between and then landing at Facebook, I just had this epiphany that I needed to go back into the mountains. And luckily New York City, as it ends up, is just down the Hudson River from what's called the Hudson Highlands, where the river kind of takes a turn through this old stone, and there's these great 1,000-foot mountains, which if you're starting at sea level is not a bad little hike, right? So I started sneaking out, and also I knew kids, so like we had babies, so everything's bananas. So I'd get up at like 4, drive up to the mountains while everybody was sleeping, an hour and a half, do a power hike, pause at the top and turn around and come down and get home before everybody was really moving, you know? And I would say that was the aha. Now it manifests very, very differently in my life today. Because today I moved to a place where I'm surrounded by more beauty, where there is
you don't have to drive to it now.
There was, I mean, I can't overemphasize that nowhere I lived in Manhattan, and I was at certain points 2 to 3 blocks from Central Park. But unless you're sleeping in Central Park, there are no birds, and there's no wind through the trees, and there's no vista except for concrete, right? Which is its own thing. And I'm glad I did it. Like, I'm proud of it. But at the same time, at a certain point, so the mountains were, going back to the mountains. And I think is like many things, a series of unfoldings, right? Lessons beget lessons beget lessons. And small things at first, like a snowball, can become huge things. So in the film, we talk about the aggregate of little things. The thesis of the movie is like, when I was a kid, I thought everything was like major seismic shifts, like things happened in milestones, like big events. And the older you get, and this is true of life and career, the more you realize that it's all increments. Every atom, every second, every choice, right? And that doesn't mean you have to be perfect at all of it.
Right.
I've been talking to my kids about this. We've stopped eating meat. And I said to the girls, listen, I consider that to be an intentional thing. I have no plan to eat some, but if a piece of bacon falls into a salad, I am not going to castigate myself, because directionally, I know that I'm endeavoring on a path towards one that I feel is more just for the planet. No judgment on anybody else's choices. That's just how I'm going. So the ahas were getting back into nature, which I think meant remembering that I was a giraffe, being in my body, remembering that, yes, I'm a human who developed a frontal lobe that is a great supercomputer for processing intellectually and executive function and assessing risk, but also I'm an animal. And at certain points, this thing, particularly if I'm under stress, maybe I carry some from my jaw being broken, or experiencing a difficult divorce, or moving halfway across the country, or having a conflict with my boss or my spouse, or maybe worse, somebody assaulted me, right? These are the things that put us all right about here. And then someone yells at us about a mask or a vaccine or anything apolitical. I'm not trying to be political. It doesn't matter. Somebody says the wrong joke on stage at the Oscars. Boom. Frontal processor offline, animal brain fully engaged, fight, flight, freeze, or appease. So I do, I am luckily coming, I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm at least coming back to these ideas that for me, it's been liberating, so grounding to understand just the simple neurobiology of me as a creature on the earth. And I don't think I had taken the time, or I had the time, or I knew I needed to focus on it. And then once you see it, Allison, as you can imagine, and you experience feeling more awake in your full experience of the human condition, pain and joy, both. I don't know, the richer life can be. And I think that's what Fred meant by deep and simple. He said to me, deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex, which is really what Bo Lozoff, who was a friend of his, would say. Contemporary culture is the opposite of the human condition. The human condition is deep and simple. Like, as creatures of the earth, as part of this planet, it does not matter whether we wear Fendi or drive an Audi or walk. It just really doesn't make any difference. It matters that we're safe. We all have a roof and we can eat. The rest really isn't why we're here, my opinion. Like, and so I don't know, I hope that some of these conversations, the work that you're doing and the work that I'm doing in the world can help, to keep tipping the scales towards right and just. Just like, we're all in this together, the animal, the gazelles, the giraffes, the wildebeest, humans, the elm trees, the Spanish moss, yada, yada, yada. And we're just dividing. And it's such a it's such a revelation. We're just cells dividing. We're just creatures on the earth, and trying to be sure that I'm passing on the best DNA that I can to Maggie and Elsie, which is try and be authentic, dare to be vulnerable, try and be an advocate for connecting deeply with each other. Try and be a person who's looking for what's best in each other. Try and acknowledge your feelings. But if they start to move to a place that feels uncomfortable, recognize it, understand it, rage and anger and frustration, but find strategies to transform it so you don't hurt yourself or you don't hurt somebody else, which back to work, Allison, you saw it every day and nobody means any harm.
Right.
For the most part.
Like some people do.
For the most part.
But sometimes the culture becomes like that, right? Because people are feeding off of that energy. So
if they're unsafe in the culture, right? Because again, I think it all comes back to safety. And safety is like, if we don't feel safe, we can't be ourselves. And if we can't be ourselves, we probably can't be very kind. Like we're bombarded with negative messages, right? Like turn on the television, listen to some ads. Like they may not be saying you're ugly, but they may as well be.
Right.
Because if I had hair, I'd be more popular. And if I drank this, I'd have more dates. And if I drove that, I would look better. Like, that's not cool. That's not right. That's not true.
Right. Oh, you are right.
Oh my gosh, I sound like a hippie radical.
No, you don't. But it really, I think it goes down to first controlling what we're consuming, to eliminate that and really fill your brain with more positive, more intentional messages, and to slow down. And I loved what you were talking about, to do more, what gave us joy in our childhood. What was that quote that Mr. Rogers said?
He said it. It's funny. I interviewed my friend Kathy Kim, who plays Sesame Street's first Asian American Muppet. And so we were trying, and she has a real strong connection between her childhood, obviously, and what she does for a day job. And so I've been trying to find the exact one, and he said it a few different ways. But the gist of it is that the child within us is still within us, right? And this goes back to me talking about being a 10-year-old. Like, is it weird to be 50 acknowledging that stuff happened and that still hurts? It feels a little weird, but it doesn't feel untrue.
Right.
Right. And so if I can just say, sometimes when someone raises their voice, it just feels weird in a weird way and I can't explain it, but it makes me not be as present as I can be with you. So if we know that together, we just made a step together towards healing each other and those around us, because we're modeling for each other. Right. This is what gives me the courage to be as hippy dippy as necessary, because I want my girls to do something different than what they're seeing right now. And I think you do too. I think the people listening and watching do. And it's the army of aggregates. Like if dozens and dozens and dozens of people are doing the right thing. Do you remember that commercial where it was like, and it was a commercial for so-and-so uses this shampoo and so on and so on and so on. And basically the screen kept dividing exponentially.
Right.
That's always how I thought of Mr. Rogers and Me, the movie. Because he said to me, spread the message. The second year I saw him, I told him, I was like, this deep and simple thing. I don't think I said, but I said, this deep and simple thing, really, I've been thinking about it all year. And he goes, spread the message. And I was like, when somebody like that gives you a mandate, and I just think even just you and me talking to each other is a start, right? And if a third person is watching or listening, boom. We just spread the message, and that's a fine place to start. In my experience, it goes further than that if you're doing the right thing, but that's a fine place to start.
I love that. Well, and also remembering that quote, what gave you joy in your childhood, and do more of that. I share the joy for outdoors and mountains. As I told you, growing up in Colorado, that makes me happy. So for everyone just to slow down and figure out how can they just be more in the moment would help a lot of people just have more clarity, but also build a foundation to be more kind.
Yeah. I was trying to think of a metaphor, and this just came to me, Allison. So let me try it out on you. I just got back from spring break driving. My wife and I drove with the kids down south to nearly Florida and back. So it's like, I don't know, 1,600, 2,000 miles. You wouldn't drive a car 24 hours for 2 weeks. It wouldn't stop, right? The car needs to stop, turn off, cool down. And we put things in the car, like a lubricant, to help it run more efficiently. So there's other prophylactic measures, sort of micro measures we could take to increase our ability to sort of manage the pace that we're all sprinting at. But I don't get the sense that at least when I was really plugging away in the sort of corporate world, until I really said, I got to pause. I don't think I spent a lot of time trying to balance my system and to put good things into it. But I just don't think the average human, I don't think most people are aware enough to, or so many people are under so much duress. So many people on earth are under so much duress that they just don't have the luxury. It's just all, fight, flight, freeze, or appease. So, finding that safety for myself and for each other just feels like just such a critical place to start. Those of us who have purchased over that, who have the latitude to be able to take those measures and to just go, okay, what's happening inside of me? What's the forecast today? When you walk in the room, what's the weather as I walk in across the street? I was thinking about that with you. Like, how am I today? Well, I'm kind of partly sunny with like clouds moving in, I think. That's, I think, where I was at when our call started, like good, but like, there's a weather system coming through, and that's okay. That's good to know, right? It's helpful to know how we're going to show up with each other, because if you got that lever, then you can go, okay, so what happens when it goes a little bit sideways? How do I make sure that we don't have a thunderstorm or a hurricane or tornado?
Right.
Two metaphors, right? Driving
I love it.
weather.
And I mean, that's a great reminder. Like when you look at your weather app, think about yourself, because so many people are more concerned, like making sure their phone is charged and like all that, instead of like, what are you actually doing, to recharge yourself? So
it's a system. Yes. And what are you putting in the system to keep it operating? I mean, healthily? It's why, the planet is not operating healthily. We're not putting healthy things into the system, and it's a closed system. I think we know that since the men landed and women have gone to space, right? And landed on the moon. But we are a system too. And I think per your scorecard, it's got to start at home, right? I just said to my wife the other day, I was like, I appreciate that some of the work that I'm doing may not make a ton of sense right away. It's a long-term investment that I have evidence based on the last 20 years, really based on my whole life. Because it's not like Fred Rogers was a bolt of lightning around a subject that I had given no thought. Fred was catalyst around a ton of energy that I already had invested in, like, why am I here? How do I make it better? How do I make sense of it? How do we create a richer fabric of connectedness and like wellness? So as you can tell, it excites me to talk about.
Oh my God, it excites me. I love it. So congratulations. You said this is your 10-year anniversary with PBS, correct?
Yeah. March, we premiered it on his birthday, March 20th, 2012. It premiered on PBS.
Well, congratulations. That's amazing. And then you also said you're also getting ready for a new documentary, and then also tell people how they can get a hold of you and also how they can watch your movie.
Sure. Well, my name is my address. When I left Facebook, I started a company that I call Essential Industries, which is named after a plaque Fred Rogers had in his office from Saint-Exupéry that said, what's essential is invisible to the eye. So I started a company called Essential Industries where I, fundamentally I coach and consult around strategy, around communications. But the heart of my work is how we show up for each other as human beings. And how do we become advocates for healing and for making our workplaces and our relationships places that are rich with positivity while acknowledging the challenges and the fundamentals. So the easiest place to find me is my name, which is benjaminwagner.com. Mr.Rogers and Me is on Apple TV or Apple Plus or whatever they call it these days. It's on Amazon Prime and MrRogersandMe.com. So yeah. Good.
And your new documentary is coming out when? Or you're just starting it?
I have not broken that news. We start shooting on Tuesday. I literally haven't talked about it anywhere.
Oh my gosh.
Fine. We basically have been doing, and when I say we, I mean my big brother, Christopher, who is a partner in Mr. Rogers and Me, who I lived with for years in New York City. We basically made the movie with a couple of friends, but he and I shot and wrote and edited and voiced, and 98% of the work was me and my big bro. And so for years we've been having a conversation, and at some point in the spring this year, I was having a conversation with Senator McBride,
Mhm.
and kind of, as I said, using my podcast, which was initially a video podcast, and we've pivoted to audio only, as a
Mhm.
means to sort of interrogate a lot of the things that we're talking about and explore a lot of these topics as they manifest in the real world with real friends and neighbors, right? And she
Mm.
shared with me, she said, so Senator McBride is the United States' first transgender state senator. So if you think about how we show up in our bodies in the world, Sarah was born a boy, and at a certain point in college said, I got to be honest, this isn't who I am, and I have to say it out loud.
Mhm.
And to me, that manifested as courage. To her, it manifested as absolute imperative. She is a superhero for what's right and just in the world to that end. So she said to me in an interview, when I share my insecurities and vulnerabilities, I feel like it gives permission for others to do the same. And
Mm.
I thought to myself, and I said to her, that's what Fred was saying, man. Right?
Yes,
That's how Fred showed up for me. He was
exactly.
absolutely present, which is kind. I felt safe and I
Mhm.
could share. And in that sharing, I healed and we all moved forward. So that's what inspired me. Sarah inspired me to just to go out and to try and sew together a great 80 or 90 minutes of stories around acknowledging that the world is coming out of a very difficult thing that we all shared, right?
Mhm.
A very difficult thing that we all shared. And it's an opportunity to talk about things that we don't often talk about, or we don't talk about enough. That which is mentionable is manageable. So production
Oh my
begins Tuesday. And here we go, a new
Well, that is
journey.
needed more than ever because we do need to support each other and we do need to be more authentic and really focus on ourselves. So I'm so excited for that. And I
Thank
know
you.
that will be out. I don't know when, but I can't
Yes.
wait to watch it because it's just
No.
like you said, if you can get a message out there that's going to be positive and outweigh all the negativity in this world, like we are making a difference. So just to remind all the listeners that you have so much power to be kind to yourself, but also like you matter so much in your actions, just as you and I really are aware of, but also Mr. Rogers was all about that. He likes us just the way we are. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for being my guest, my first guest. I love the foundation of your relationship with him, but also how you have more clarity even in his message today. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. And this goes to you, and this goes to the previous point that you just made, that my very favorite Fredism, and it's the beginning of our film, Mr. Rogers and Me, there is something of yourself that you leave at every meeting with another person.
Mm-hmm.
What I love about that is that it invests in us the responsibility to make a decision in relationship of how we're going to show up, right? And that's going to leave something with each other. And do you want to leave like growth, creation? Do you want to put energy into the system, or the opposite? And I think almost all of us, probably all of us, because I think even people who do really awful things in the world, war, stuff like that, I think all of us really just want to be treated kindly and want somebody to hold us and say, I get it. It's really hard, but you can do this.
Love that. Well, thank you again. It was lovely to see you, and I can't wait to share this message with all our listeners. Thank you.
Back at you.
Thank you.